My name is Anna Vignoles and I'm Director of the Leverhulme Trust. If we think about almost all social developments, economic progress, technology, art, culture, so much of that which makes us human is underpinned by academic endeavour and by research. So when we think about the importance of research, one way of answering that question is to think of it in instrumental terms. We can point to a range of outcomes from research and say, look, that's the value of research. For example, here at the Leverhulme Trust, we've funded a centre that looks at demographic modelling. It was used to great effect during COVID to try and understand how the population was responding to some of the restrictions. It's now being used to target humanitarian aid in conflict zones. So at one level, it's quite straightforward to say, well, there's a piece of research or a whole decade of research that's going to be really impactful, really useful for a real world setting. But I think the instrumental use of research is only one part of the story. The other part of the story is the intellectual benefits of research, just simply pursuing knowledge for its own sake. And that is, if you like, what our ultimate human progress depends on, because much of what you do in research, you don't know where it's going, and that's the point. Our progress as a society has often relied on things that at the time weren't obvious in terms of where they were going to take us. And at the Trust, of course, what we do is we fund blue skies research, so the stuff that you don't know how it's going to end. And I think that's vitally important in terms of human progress. So I think we can think of different types of research. One term that's often used is fundamental research or basic research, and also known as blue skies research. And basic or fundamental research is research that underpins a lot, but isn't necessarily going to have a short-term impact on the real world. So the reason why we call it blue skies research is you know the question is important, or you think the question is important, and you want to try and answer it, but you don't really know where it's going in terms of, if you do answer it, what will it mean to the world? That's left as an open question. So it's that fundamental bit. Translational research is when you take some ideas, normally from basic fundamental research, and think about how they might translate into real world applications. Once you're doing translational research, obviously the aim is to impact on the real world, either in the short or the medium term, and it's far easier to see where that research might be heading. It doesn't mean you succeed, but you know what you're aiming to do in terms of a sort of real world impact. As an individual researcher, I think what drives you is the idea that you are going to move the field forward, that your intellectual contribution is going to make our understanding clearer. And when you look back, it will be obvious that you stood on the shoulders of giants, as they say, and moved the field in a positive direction. And I think it's that sort of intellectual curiosity that actually characterises researchers. But I think it's also important not to be too highfalutin about all research. I was a very pragmatic, practical researcher, and my aim was to do research that could inform policy. I think that's a really important aspect of research. So there are different types of research for different purposes, and different academics have different motivations. I think what is important is that we as a society, and indeed as a set of universities, recognise the value of that research and do far more to inform the public about the value of that research, and sort of join the dots about how a piece of perhaps esoteric maths research has ended up being absolutely pivotal for the development of AI. These things need to be brought to the fore, because that's really how we will take the public with us in terms of support for research in the future. It's a very interesting question about should you prioritise different topics in research. And of course, many funders do prioritise topics. If you're, for example, a government funder, you clearly would prioritise topics partly because you have to be accountable to the taxpayer for funding that research. But for us at the Leverhulme, we do the blue skies version of research, which means that we can afford to be very agnostic in our choice of topics. That doesn't mean, however, that we shouldn't prioritise research, but we do it on the basis of whether that research is likely to make an intellectual contribution. We don't pick disciplines. We fund right the way across all the disciplines except medicine. And we do that deliberately because if you think about most real-world problems, actually they tend to be interdisciplinary. And I don't just mean the big stuff. Obviously, climate change is a multidisciplinary challenge for us all. But I mean, even when you've got something quite specific, like in my field, for example, studying labour markets, actually economists don't have all the answer because at the moment, the psychological response to political uncertainty amongst the young and various other factors are affecting the economic behaviour of both firms and individuals. So even that sort of quite specific area turns into being a multidisciplinary problem. So from our perspective, or from the Leverhulme Trust perspective, it's really important that you don't get locked into funding particular disciplines. Now, obviously, some topics are more important than others as judged by our peer reviewers, and there may be research questions that people view as trivial, and we probably end up not funding those. But nonetheless, I think it's important to keep an open mind as to which topics you think are interesting. I actually think that a diversity of sources of funding for research is really vital, and it's one of the UK's great strengths. We have a lot of different sources of funding for research, and they tend to play different roles. So as I said, if you're thinking about government funding, clearly that has to be at least oriented towards asking and answering questions that the public have a pressing interest in the short and medium term, but obviously also important to keep one eye on the long term. In terms of philanthropy and philanthropic funding of research, we can take greater risks, we can invest in people in a slightly different way, we can be a lot more laid back about which topics we fund and which topics we don't in terms of they don't have to meet a particular public interest need in the short or medium term. So those two sources of funding complement each other nicely. And indeed, universities also fund research and there are multiple funders in the system. And I think because there's a diversity of funding sources, it also means that very different types of research get funded, and that's vital because you couldn't have a system that was entirely made up of blue skies research, but equally, if all you focus on is applied translational research, you're not going to have the quality of researchers and research that underpins really good applied research. You need the basics as well. I absolutely agree that investing in humanities research is vital. In fact, here at the Leverhulme, we introduced a specific scheme just for that. So we have what we call major research fellowships, which are targeting humanities researchers to enable them to do scholarship and research. So it is absolutely vital. But I might take issue with the idea that there's a sort of dichotomy between humanities research, which is what makes us human, and other types of research, say scientific or technological, that makes us machine-like. I'm not sure that's the right characterization of the world that we live in. I actually think that you need to draw from a range of disciplines, and one thing's for sure, that we need humanities, we need ethics and philosophy when we're doing research on genetics or research into AI. But we also need statistical rigour when we're trying to interpret historical data. And I think the more I go on in life, the more I'm convinced that academia, which tends to divide down into different disciplines, different subject areas, is held back by those divisions. And we haven't always organised knowledge into very clear disciplinary areas. In fact, the polymath, or the era of the polymath, was when we made a huge amount of scientific and research progress back in the day. So I do think those disciplinary distinctions can limit our imagination at times. Leverhulme has always prided itself on taking risks when funding research, and when I took up the post as director, that was one of my first questions as to, what does that actually mean to take a risk in research? And I think there are risks that we take at different levels. First of all, we take risks on people. So someone who doesn't have a long track record can still apply to us and get funded, and that risk that you take is this person going to fly, and you hope that your funding is going to help them to do so. We also take a risk on topic in the sense that we funded things that we had no idea really whether they were going to work. I don't mean whether they were going to be valuable in the future, but literally would the researcher be able to tackle that question effectively and get an answer? And we regularly have projects that don't work, and that's kind of part and parcel of doing risky funding. And then, of course, there's the risk that you take when you choose a topic that might be controversial or seen as not very topical or slightly offbeat. And we do our fair amount of funding of those kinds of projects. We've funded projects into dancing bees. We've funded projects into very challenging maths equations that we have no idea what the benefit will be, but it sounds interesting. And it's sort of all those different types of risks combined that I think make for quite an exciting research agenda. The risks taken by academics is a very interesting area. The risk you take is, of course, that you do research that might be very challenging, difficult, and everybody understands that risk. So you try a new project and it might fail. I think the risks that are less visible but are just as important to the researcher are the risks that you take in your choice of topic and your choice of funder. And if, for example, funders really emphasize the need for research that has short-term impact, that's going to massively affect the types of topic that researchers choose. If you like, they get risk averse in terms of choosing topics that might not work or take a long time before you get answers, and they prioritize things that are shorter term. So there are lots of different kind of risk judgments that go into an academic deciding what topics they're actually going to research. And of course, the biggest risk for an academic is that much of research takes a very long time. You might work on a problem for years and years and years, and you're hoping that it pays off in the end, but you have to kind of take that leap of faith, and that's why researchers are quite unusual people.